Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Iceberg podcast, brought to you as always by Inside the Penguins, a proud affiliate of the Hockey News. I'm your host, Nick Belsky, joined as always by Nick Horwat. And it's interesting because we've already reached, it seems, the dead period of the offseason. Not a lot going on involving the Pittsburgh Penguins. Seems like we get one or two pieces of news per week. Still waiting on that first piece this week. Last week, the big one was Valtteri Puustinen, which we talked about yesterday on Ice-Burgh To Go. But today, we're going to talk about a couple former Pittsburgh Penguins that could find themselves on the trade block for their respective teams this summer and whether or not they would be a fit for the Penguins next season. Then, speaking of fits, we'll talk a little bit about former Toronto Maple Leafs head coach Sheldon Keefe, obviously a major name of interest around the coaching carousel. Is he a fit in Pittsburgh, and where does he fit if he ends up joining former buddy Kyle Dubas? And then we'll close out the show talking a little bit about Penguins prospects. We've been all over the prospect talk, all over the young Penguins talk as the Pens look to get younger next season, looking for that youth movement. But before we get into that, Horwat, how disappointed were you in Alex Nedeljkovic being pulled in his first action in World Championships over in Czechia?
Considering the team he played against Slovakia, and it was 4 goals on 16 shots, that is kind of disappointing. Part of me, though, however, is not totally surprised. I've said before, like, it was great that he went on that tremendous run down the stretch, but also it's not like he was blowing teams away. It really wasn't. He was still giving up a handful of goals every so often. And this was his first action since the end of the season. So it's not like he's been fresh. He was coming in, I guess, a little cold. He also wasn't even part of the original lineup announcement, so they kind of added him in. But it's a fun tournament to keep an eye on. It's always so weird to think that it's not super important in the grand scheme of things, but it's also one of the longest tenured tournaments in hockey. So it lives in one of those weird spots. But hey, you know what? If he gets another crack at it, I'm sure he'll do just fine. Team USA still is a good team in front of him that can make some sort of noise. There's still an opportunity to crack something special there.
From Czechia back to North America, let's talk a little bit about some familiar faces that could land on the Penguins' radar. The Penguins currently have 12 forwards signed at the NHL level with that addition of Valtteri Puustinen late last week. Some are expected to be moved. You wrote a story about potential buyout candidates, and even though Kyle Dubas doesn't like buyouts, those are the same candidates that could be up for being traded by the Pittsburgh Penguins this summer to make room for some of the young players that are expected to be given a shot. However, the Penguins should and probably will make sure they have contingencies, whether that's the guys they have on the roster or if they move on from the Matt Nietos of the world and they try to open up some opportunities in the Penguins roster, they would probably need to bring in a player that says, oh, if none of these guys, if Koivunen and Ponomarev, if they need some more seasoning at the AHL level, you're not going to try to force them into that. You're not going to put the entire fate of the bottom of your lineup into the hands of guys that haven't had a lot of NHL experience. So you would expect some experienced guys to be brought back in exchange. The free agent market is one thing. The trade market is a completely different thing. And today we're going to look a little bit at the trade market because the price on the contract is typically lower. Then all you need to do is take a look at the acquisition cost. And I feel like I found 2 players where the acquisition cost is going to be a little bit lower. But before we get into this, they are former Penguins, Horwat. What are your thoughts on bringing in former Penguins at this stage after they've already moved on? Are you somebody that says, no, leave that in the past? You need new blood, you need fresh blood, you need different players? Or are you somebody that says, no matter who you bring in, as long as they're a fit for next year's team, it doesn't matter if they have a prior history with the organization?
I'm more on the latter of that one. Just as long as there's a good fit, as long as they can help the team out and they can produce, it's something that could and should work out, especially considering knowing a couple of the names that we're going to be talking about in a moment here. At least 1 or 2 of them have a solid resume with the Penguins, and at least in one case really should not have left in the first place, or at least fans did not want to leave in the first place. So there is that sort of history of there is success there. There is a history of useful play and stuff to fall back on. Yeah, these players are a couple years older now because just the way time is. but still it's something you can fall on and saying there's a chemistry there, there's a familiarity there. It's not coaching staff has changed too much in those years. And with the new voice of a coaching staff coming in as well, eventually at some point, maybe just a new spark arises for different areas of the lineup. I mean, we saw, I forget how many players it was, but it was a good chunk of the lineup get overhauled last summer. If that overhaul happens again and it happens to be familiar names, it's, a whole new situation.
Yeah, it should shorten that, learning about each other process that we saw early in the season for the Penguins. And if you look at, a couple examples in Pittsburgh, it's not all former Penguins, but former players that general manager Kyle Dubas brought in. He had a guy in Michael Bunting in Toronto. He brings him in. It looks like it's a fit. It looks like it's going to be a very good thing for the Penguins going forward. And that's a former player that he was able to reassign to one of his teams. And then if you look at a guy a year ago, and Nick Bonino, that was a former Penguin, it just didn't work out. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And with that, I want to ask you the main question here, Horwat. Would you rather the Penguins target one of Brandon Tanev or Evan Rodriguez? Because both at the moment could be on the trade block for their team this summer. When you look at each position and each team's position, they're up against the salary cap, and they each have their own reasons why they might have to shed one of the two contracts. If you look at the Kraken, they're up against the cap right now. They have to sign Matty Beniers to a contract. What does that look like, and how much cap space does that take up? Not only that, they only have 8 NHL forwards and 5 defensemen, so a lot of bodies that they need to fill, and they don't have a lot of money coming off the books. Meanwhile, down in Florida, as they're going for a Stanley Cup right now, they need to re-sign Brandon Montour, Sam Reinhart, who was one of the league leaders in goals this year, and Anton Lundell. They also have raises already on the books for Eetu Luostarinen and Gustav Forsling that eat up about, I think, $5 million, if memory serves me correct. So that's a lot of cap space, a lot of cap situations where both Tanev and Rodriguez could be on the chopping block if those teams need some space. Which one would you rather the Penguins target?
Yeah, it seems like they both might be on the move because Florida's got to make some big signings, and Seattle it seems like they're about to undergo some pretty big change. Of the two, I think I would personally take Brandon Tanev because he was a player that genuinely felt like he shouldn't have left in the first place. He has a year left on the deal, so it's not like you're locked into I think it's 3 more for Rodriguez. Rodriguez's deal was cheaper by sheer AAV, but only by $500,000. And if Tanev just has that 1 year left, we know what he can bring. He's going to be a pain to play against. Picturing him and Michael Bunting, not sharing a line, but sharing a team that just sounds like unfun for opposing teams. So making the Penguins unfun to play against, tough to play against, is part of the Mike Sullivan plan always. They do it in different ways. Michael Bunting obviously does some good offense, but Brandon Tanev does it in that way of just being a bit of a pest, but also providing for the team. Yeah, he had a down year, but also can still bring something to the table. And especially if it's just for one more year, let him walk to UFA afterwards and see what we get for one season out of him. I think that's where I would go. Evan Rodriguez, I know I just said maybe there would be different outcomes because time has passed. He has a bit more of a consistency to his game now. I still can't get over that second half of his season. Still, from 2 years ago, I still can't get over what he was unable to produce in the second half of the, 21-22 season?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm sure by now, if he was to come back, I'm sure it'd be a much different situation. But still, it's I think I just enjoy Tanev and that idea more than I do Rodriguez.
Mm-hmm. With Rodriguez, you are getting somebody that can play up and down the lineup. Now, he's primarily been a third liner, bottom 6 type of guy this season for the Florida Panthers because, well, the Florida Panthers are stacked. He was a guy, though, last year that was playing up and down the lineup for a good Colorado Avalanche team due to injuries. It sounds familiar. It's exactly what he did for the Penguins the year prior in that 2021-22 season that you mentioned there. And I think that you're getting a higher ceiling when it comes to scoring points and scoring goals in Evan Rodriguez. Now, he had 39 this season in 80 games as compared to Brandon Tanev, who really fell off as far as the offensive production, but so too did everybody for the Seattle Kraken. I mean, their shooting percentage as a team plummeted this season, and that affected not just Tanev's bottom line, it affected everybody's bottom line when it comes to their total points scored. But I agree with you in the fact that Brandon Tanev brings something that the Penguins are in need of. They have it in Michael Bunting. Drew O'Connor's hoping to develop it over the summer, but they need to be harder to play against, because you said Mike Sullivan, he likes that being his motto, but at the same time, this team has not been hard to play against for a long time. You need more players like a Tanev. You need more players like a Michael Bunting, and having those two on the ice together certainly helps. I mean, you think of a guy like Trent Frederick for Boston, who has been such a big pivotal piece for them. It's not that he's lighting the world on fire offensively. It's that he is a pest and he does other things well. Brandon Tanev and Evan Rodriguez both, they can play on the penalty kill. They can play well at 5-on-5, and they can play anywhere in your bottom six. With Evan Rodriguez having a little bit more flexibility to move up to the top six, play a little bit of power play, and also move into center if need be. He hasn't played a lot the last couple of seasons, but I think of the two, I would agree with you. I think bringing in a guy like Brandon Tanev, simply because of where the Penguins stand as an organization. If the Penguins didn't have those options that they were ready to give a chance to, those Ponomarevs, those Koivunins, those potentially Braden Yagers, then you bring in Evan Rodriguez and you say at 30 years old, he still has the legs. You know, that's what everybody's going to say. These guys are old. Both of them still have their legs, and that's all that matters at this point. Rodriguez has the legs. He has some offensive production that he's been able to keep up with Lundell and Luosterainen down in that third line in Florida. And he has the ability to kill those penalties and move up and down the lineup at will, as he always has. So I think that it's a good option for the Penguins if they're not as sold on giving 3 or 4 roster spots to these young guys as opposed to 1 or 2 or maybe 3, which is where I think they really are at this point in the offseason. We'll see what they're able to conjure up with the trades and the opening of free agency. But I think because of that, 1 year of Brandon Tanev is so easy to maneuver. We saw them do it with Jeff Carter. If you need to sit a guy for a handful of games, 5-6 games, to give an opportunity to see what you have in a Koivunen, to see what you have in maybe a Tristan Brose, then you can do that. It's easy to maneuver. And also, Brandon Tanev, Lars Eller, Nola Chari, it's pretty hard to play against fourth line. And that's tough, a fourth line that people are not going to want to go out there and play against. They're not going to give very much up in the defensive zone, and they're going to have the opportunity, especially if you move a Chari over to the wing, they're going to have the opportunity to score a couple of goals with Tanev being somebody that always has had that sneaky offensive upside. He just hasn't been able to have the finish, which perfectly fits in with the Sullivan system. So I think they're two interesting options. And I think of the two, simply because of where the Pens are at, I agree with you going with Tanev.
Yeah. Another piece too is this is just starting to, big brain it and start to think a little bit more seriously about it. Tanev's going to be a cheaper trade to pull off. He's got 1 year left. There's a modified clause there, but you could easily work that. Also, it's already possible the Penguins are one of the available teams. But he's, like I said, final year. Evan Rodriguez has 3 years left at $3 million. The Florida Panthers signed him to that deal, so they're expecting something out of him. Also, if you wanted to make that deal, you may have to pay the Stanley Cup tax. That Florida Panthers team looks deadly right now, and he's part of that deadliness. He's part of a pretty good team that I didn't expect Evan Rodriguez to kind of produce like that in the postseason, but he had a 2-goal performance not too long ago, had some big assists in, I think, their most recent win. And they're about to put the Bruins to sleep, and who knows where they go from there. They've got a real good chance of making the run. So you may have to pay a Stanley Cup tax, too, if you're looking to anywhere toward Florida.
Yeah, 6 points in 9 games, 3 of them being goals for Evan Rodriguez. It's a very good point by you. It'll be interesting to see if the Penguins even reach out to either of these two guys. And it's going to be interesting to see if these two guys end up on the trade block. Like I mentioned, both organizations that they play for are in a difficult position when it comes to some important players that need to be re-signed. You mentioned Brandon Montour to me a couple weeks ago. Man, wouldn't it be nice if the Penguins could get him? It would be. It's going to be expensive, especially if he ends up making it to the free market on July 1st. But we'll have to keep an eye on that. Obviously, we're going to go through a lot of different options for the Penguins and where they could fit into their roster and their lineup next season. But Brandon Tanev, Evan Rodriguez, let us know in the comments, what do you think of the Penguins reacquiring them? Let's move over and talk a little bit about Sheldon Keefe and the Pittsburgh Penguins coaching staff. Sheldon Keefe was fired by the Toronto Maple Leafs officially, even though everybody saw it coming since the end of their season. Even some said that it could happen before they got to the end of their season, but he was officially fired by the Toronto Maple Leafs last week. He had a 212, 97, and 40 record in the regular season. That's over 5 years. Toronto was great in the regular season. The problem lies with his playoff performance. 1 series win in 5 years, a 16-21 playoff record for Sheldon Keefe, and that is ultimately the reason that he gets the axe up there in Ontario. Where do you think the Penguins would want him? They have several positions open. Obviously, he's not going to be an American Hockey League assistant coach, but between AHL head coach of the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins and NHL assistant/associate, we don't know who's going to get what role in Todd Reardon's position, but between those two, where do you think the Penguins would want Keefe the most?
It's honestly really tough considering it's one of those debates that I have in my head where it could go either way. I would think the AHL fits him better because that's where he's had success before. And I keep going to the well of the Penguins, or at least Kyle Dubas and Jason Spezza are trying to build a robust minor league system that can be successful for themselves, but also be a great development situation for these young guys that we're talking about getting cracks to the NHL lineup as soon as next year. So they're going to need an NHL style, or at least an NHL voice in that spot in the AHL. The only problem is you just need someone willing to essentially take a demotion to go to Northeastern PA, ride the buses to everywhere across this continent, essentially. So that's a tough sell. That's why I thought maybe Keefe would be the one to take that situation, because it's got that familiarity with Kyle Dubas. He's had success in that league with Kyle Dubas before, and there's familiarity with Jason Spezza, who is heading that search specifically. I think that would be his best fit, but who knows if he wants it. I mean, you read that record. You read that NHL record. He is a better coach than many fans and critics will give him credit for, but who knows where it goes from there. I would say the AHL would be the best fit for him in the Penguins organization. Mm-hmm. If he was to be assistant, I mean, those power play numbers didn't look too terrible. Someone's got to take that over. It also helps he had Austin Matthews, Mitch Marner, Morgan Riley, John Tavares to an extent, and William Nylander. I knew I was forgetting one.
Well, I mean, you could say the same thing about the Penguins to a certain extent, and they still had the 30th ranked power play in the National Hockey League. So names, as we've learned, don't always mean everything for the man advantage. It is interesting because Keefe's up for head coaching gigs. The one that makes the most sense and has had the most noise is the New Jersey Devils. And some believe and have said that he's not going to go back to the American Hockey League, that he'd take a year off before he would go back and take an American Hockey League gig. I think that is mostly true, but I think if he doesn't get one of those head coaching jobs and Dubas comes calling and says, listen, you could always go out for head coaching gigs next year after you win another Calder Cup with the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins. That would be great. You could always go back for head coaching gigs next year. And there's an possibility that if Mike Sullivan stays, and which we all expect him to, and doesn't succeed again next season, there's a possibility that ends up being it. If he goes another year without making the playoffs or another year without winning a playoff series, that might be it. But again, that's a tough sell because everybody can see the strength of the connection between Sullivan and the Penguins organization, how it's going to take a lot for that to be severed from a fireable standpoint. Now, that's going to be the hardest thing to really get through to Keefe. But at the same time, you know, if he doesn't get any of those gigs, what's better? Taking a year off when you are getting paid.
Yep.
Toronto's going to pay him his full salary for the next 2 years. Or do you want to, work on that AHL system? And the only other thing I'll say is if Dubas and Spezza really want to build up that system, because let's face it, the end of this era of Penguins hockey is quickly approaching, which means the importance of the American Hockey League is going to be very, very, increased a lot over the next couple of years. Do you want a guy that's going to be there for 1, maybe 2 seasons? Or do you want a guy that's going to be there for the long haul that can really build up the spearhead of your organization in the American Hockey League? That's really the lever between the young prospects and the National Hockey League. That's one thing I'm looking at too.
Thinking outwards of this, looking at the long game, let's say Sheldon Keefe decides to take that AHL deal because he's getting an NHL salary for the next 2 years, wherever he works. Let's say he takes that AHL deal. The way I see it, and the way we should all see it, one more missed postseason, and genuinely that conversation needs to happen with Mike Sullivan. Like, okay, that's 3 in a row. That's enough of that. Yeah. Regardless of who you know, who you're close with, that should be enough of that. But let's say Mike Sullivan has a better season. Let's say the Penguins squeak back into the playoffs. Who knows how long they would sign Keefe for in this situation. But what happens is, okay, eventually Mike Sullivan's tank will run empty, we think. And it's probably coming soon. Well, you have an NHL-ready head coach in the AHL right now. Bump him up, and what does he do? Does exactly what Mike Sullivan did, brings all those players with him that maybe grew with him, grew under him, kind of, like we said, they want to build that robust system down there of development. They developed with him, and now they put that into the NHL system because the Penguins have seen that work before, and then that becomes a good success from that because it's that stepping stone. It's exactly why Dan Bilesma might become the next head coach of the Seattle Kraken, by the way.
Yeah.
Because they're going to have a bunch of players that come up from Coachella Valley who lost in the Calder Cup final last year and I believe are still in the middle of a playoff run this year. They could get that. He might get that call, and then there come a bunch of AHL names to come right with him. And then next thing you know, they're a good powerhouse again. So that'd be an ideal situation to be playing the long game. It would be satisfying Mike Sullivan's idea of sticking around because he wants to see it through, because he's loyal to this team and he believes he can do it. The Penguins believe he can do it, and the front office believes he can do it.
Yeah.
And then you have that backup plan in Sheldon Keefe to play the Mike Sullivan role from 2015. We hired you in. Now bring your boys up whenever you're ready.
Yeah, and play the Dan Bilesma role from 2009. Yeah, 2009 as well. I mean, we've seen it happen for the Penguins, and it's something that Keefe did with Toronto Marlies, although he won the championship in the AHL and then came up to the NHL. And that's the next question, the next part of this is do you think that Keefe would even be a solid hire for the Penguins as the prospected next coach and the heir apparent to Mike Sullivan? Like, is he a candidate that you think could actually be a good head coach for the Penguins eventually, which is what we're taking Keefe at? You don't hire Keefe simply to be that AHL farmhand that's going to mold all these players and then ship them off to somebody else. You hire Keefe to eventually become your head coach. Is that a name that you would actually want? Or is it somebody that, because of his track record where he hasn't won in the playoffs, that you don't really want that to be the next guy? You want a new face. You want a fresh feel in the AHL.
So a lot of times I would say they're not winning in the playoffs. Maybe it's the players. There were some of those series where genuinely Sheldon Keefe was getting out coached. But there were also some series where he was the better coach, or at least there were some games where he was the better coach in that situation. I would say that because there is time to see how Mike Sullivan progresses, to see how Sheldon Keefe even progresses in the system, if this is all hypothetical, but if that was to happen, I would say it's a good, solid maybe. I would like him to be the next head coach just because you don't know what the future holds for Mike Sullivan. You don't know what the future holds for Sheldon Keefe or other coaching options. Remember, there's still another vacancy that needs to be filled. Who knows? Maybe he goes on to win a Calder Cup with Wilkes-Barre next year because and then say that same year, Mike Sullivan missed the playoffs again. Well, suddenly it's all right. We have a championship coach in the AHL system. There's no way Sullivan returns after 3 straight missed postseasons. Poof, there you go. That sounds like a good idea, or at least a step up from what we've had. So I would say it's a solid maybe. There's a lot of depending on things, right?
Yeah, and I also think there's a part of this where if the Penguins are on track to miss the postseason or even be close to missing the postseason with a team that is agreed upon universally better on paper than the last 2 years, there's a chance Sullivan doesn't make it through the season. Now, again, slim chance. But if you get to that point in January and February where you were this year, and you're saying, well, we might have to sell at the deadline, what are you keeping around a lame duck head coach for then? You need to change things around. You need to give Crosby as many kicks at the can as he can. So maybe at that point, but again, these are all hypotheticals because as of right now, that bond is as strong as it can be for a team that hasn't won a playoff series since 2018.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's interesting. And for the Keefe of it all, his stars failed to show up way too often. You know where that doesn't happen very often? Pittsburgh. So
Yeah.
I'd
Yeah.
like to see him with a core that is talented, which he did have, but
Mm-hmm.
actually shows up in the playoffs. Mitch Marner on and off again.
Yeah.
Austin Matthews on and off again. I mean, this year, obviously extenuating circumstances with his sickness and illness and then injury and whatever was going on. Same thing with Nylander early in the
Yep.
series, but I mean, you go back the last 4 years, it's not like Sheldon Keefe has gotten great performances out of his star players. So maybe,
Yeah.
just maybe, that was the straw that broke the camel's back every season. Maybe it was his coaching. Maybe it was a combination of both, which is probably the answer. But at the end of the day, he is one of the top coaching candidates for a reason. If the Penguins are able to snap him up on an AHL deal, I think that'd be a nice piece of business and certainly a nice story to follow along with going into next season. But let's close out this show with our weekly Pens poll. Which prospect are you most excited to see get a chance at the NHL level next season? We asked this yesterday on X, formerly known as Twitter. We had 3 players out there, and then we put an other there. We'll talk about the others here in a couple minutes, but let's start with the 3 that we put out there. Ville Koivunen comes away with the top vote getters here, 58%. Tristan Brose gets 21%. A lot of people not too excited about Sam Poulin, 13% of the vote. Horwat, who are you most excited to see, and are you surprised at how little Sam Poulin got in this vote?
I don't know if I'm surprised by that, but that is my answer. Just because we've waited so long to see what he can do, and this should finally be the year where it comes to fruition that it is his full look at the NHL level. Just that waiting game that we've been playing should finally be paying off, and that's my answer. Still wanted. I mean, we haven't had Koivunen around for too long. Curious to see what he can do and what he can bring. That's up there, and I mean, some of the other names too are just as impressive and interesting. But I'd say my answer sticks with Poulin as well.
See, I'm gonna go with the field here. I'm gonna go with Ville Koivunen simply because of how dominant he was in the Finnish league this year. He was, in some instances, historically good for his age in the Finnish league. He came over, had a goal in his first game at the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins level in the playoffs, was only able to play 2 games, but play alongside a guy like Sam Poulin. So I'm intrigued by him. And if I was to say which of these young players, Koivunen, Brose, Poulin, we'll even throw in guys like Vasily Ponomarev, which of them are most likely to get that first kick at the can next year? I think Koivunen is up there. Now, Jaeger's a little bit of a different story because if he's not at the NHL level, he's back at the WHL with the Moose Jaw Warriors. So I think that kind of throws a wrench into this competition a little bit. I think that gives Braden Jaeger a chance to potentially make the team out of camp more simply because they can get that 10-game sample size and then send him back and have it on a slide. Whereas I do think Koivunen comes over from and stays in North America next year. I do think if he's not at the NHL, he's going to be playing at the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins level. But I do think that as of right now, he is the guy that would make the biggest impact on the NHL roster when it comes to scoring goals, playing up in the lineup a little bit, maybe third line to start potentially if need be, see what he looks like on one of those top 2 lines. So I think that's the guy I'm most excited to see simply because I don't know where his ceiling is, but he's been playing against professionals over in Finland, and he's been doing it really well at a very young age. I'm intrigued to see how that transfers over. It's similar to what a guy like Valtteri Pustin was doing. He was playing very well in Finland, came over, transferred into being the top goal scorer and top point scorer for the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins for 2 seasons. And now you see what he was able to do this past year with 20 points in 52 games. Where on that spectrum is Koivunen? That's what I'm most excited to see out of these 3. I don't think Brose is going to get much of a look simply because it's going to be his first year in professional hockey coming out of the college ranks. If he does indeed stay at the AHL level, I don't think he can go back now that he's signed to an ELC. But again, rules for different junior leagues and colleges make it very difficult to figure out there.
I think the NCAA is going to start lightening up on the CHL participation.
Yes.
I don't know about AHL or or if a contract is involved or whatever. I don't know how it all works. The NCAA is weird and it's still learning a lot, it seems sometimes, but and again, it's hockey. It's like the only sport they deal with where there are systems like this anyway. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that all rolls. And I would say when it comes to Tristan Brose, I like his chance of being a good product in the AHL to see what he can do at that level, maybe under Sheldon Keefe, and then go from there.
Yeah, I'm trying to see some of the rules. Obviously, they can play at the end of the NCAA season, but there's nothing that I can find quickly on whether or not once they're signed to a contract, because let's not forget, Bros played those AHL games on a tryout portion of his contract.
Yeah.
So it isn't technically counting to this point, but I guess the odds are whether or not the Penguins want to send him back next year or if they want to keep him at the AHL level. We'll have to wait and see. But the others that were thrown out there by our listeners were Braden Yeager, was in that 9% of other, and Joel Blomqvist as well. Of those two, obviously, Yeager is the guy that has all the headlines. He's one of the only prospects that are still playing at this moment in time in the WHL championship, as the Moose Jaw Warriors have a 2-0 series lead. But Blomqvist is an interesting one because I think Blomqvist is one that we are guaranteed to see some games played for next year. Now, whether or not the Penguins end up wanting him to be their backup goaltender remains to be seen, but that could very well be the case coming into fall, where it's Tristan Jarry and Joel Blomqvist. You've mentioned a couple times, look at what they did at the trade deadline. They had a lot of faith in Blomqvist to be their guy going down the rest of the AHL season. Not only that, but being their number 3 in the organization in general, especially with a goaltender in Tristan Jarry that has had his issues with injuries. So going to be intriguing to see where the Penguins view him this summer and what moves they make ahead of him at the goaltending ranks in the organization.
Yeah, I'm going to be intrigued to see what Blomqvist's trajectory looks like here. It's how much faith are they putting into him as a backup, maybe to start the season, or if, Kyle Dubas put his stamp on Tristan Jarry and expecting a bounce back season next year. That doesn't mean much, though. I forget who it was. Someone tweeted, everyone, we have to remember, he said he trusted Jeff Petrie coming into the organization. See how that went. So take Kyle Dubas's words for if that player does stick around. This goes for any of them. If those players do stick around, they're going to expect more. For sure. You're going to expect more from every player in a new season. That doesn't mean, for Tristan Jarry at least, that his job is safe. And neither is Nedeljkovic's for that matter, and that one almost seems certain he's gone, considering the way Kyle Dubas talked about it at the end of the season press conference. So it's going to come down to Joel Blomqvist as a guy in the system for sure, as a guy in the top 3, I should say, regardless of what happens with Nedeljkovic or Jarry. He's going to be looked upon as an option and an NHL-ready option. And like you said, I would absolutely expect him to get playing time, whether it's a lot or a little, at some point this upcoming season.
Now, there's obviously been a lot of talk about the youth movement and how many spots are going to be available during training camp next year. I think that when you look at it, there's going to be spots. But like I mentioned earlier in this episode, I think it's going to be closer to the 2, maybe 3 versus the 3, maybe 4 that I think a lot of people are hoping. And I think one of those spots has to go to Valtteri Puustinen. And I think I include that spot simply because Puustinen struggled during training camp and he struggled out the gates at the American Hockey League level this past season. If he struggles in the same way, I don't think it's guaranteed that he is just brought along and kept at the National Hockey League level. I think there's a chance they could end up sending him back in favor of one of these guys. So I put his roster spot in amongst those, and I still think that it's only 2 or 3. But of those 2 or 3 outside of Puustinen, who do you think has the best chance at cracking the lineup of these young guys? And we'll throw Ponomarev in there as well.
I'll still say Sam Poulin. It's just, he's got the position. He was in the position before. He was going to get the longer look had he not gotten sick. And then other players just sort of came, to take the lineup spots. I'd say he's going to get the best look out of camp. He had a great prospect tournament before the camp started, had a good camp, had a good preseason, and then was having a good season at the AHL level before injuries derailed things. And then getting to the NHL, he only had 3 games again. And it's tough to do much in 3 games when the team was in the position they were in of relying on the top names, relying on the big names, the top 2 lines. It's going to be tough for a depth player to really, especially one in his position, to show out and show what he can do. So I'd say with a clean slate one more time, he's going to get that push and should start. I don't want to see him on the fourth line. Should start on the third line or second. Who knows what he has to do?
Yeah, I don't. Second would be interesting.
Yeah.
Second would be interesting. I think there's a lot of top six players that are right now obviously filling out the top six for the Penguins. What is the future for Riley Smith? What is the future for Rickard Rakell? That'll give us a little bit more of an answer and a leeway into if there's opportunity for these young guys to get that high in the lineup from day one. But I think it's interesting that Poulin only got 13% here. You know, a lot of people, because of his 6 games at the National Hockey League level, are down on him. But in those 6 games this year, the 3 games he played, he started on the fourth line. And at what point did he start getting sick? Who knows? Also, it's only 6 games, right? He also was very good at the American Hockey League level. But I think there's this feeling about Poulin, because he was a first-round pick back in 2019, that it has been now 5 years, and he's only played a half dozen games and hasn't scored a point in any of them. I think he looked a lot better this year in his limited time, but again, it's only 3 games. How much can you really judge? But I think that with the overall vibe on him being down, I think people just need to understand that of these players, he presents the most complete game. He presents the most Mike Sullivan-esque game where he is tough to play against down low. He is good in the front of the net. He has that scoring ability just as a Koivunen or a Palmarev have, but he's really good at the 200-foot style of play that the Penguins need in their bottom 6. He's a big guy. He's tougher to move off the puck, and he's more filled out than a lot of these other guys are. So I'm interested to see, you know, how he handles this season, because we all know what happened going into last offseason and the battles he had to face throughout that offseason to come back and have a really good year despite all these injuries. What does he do now that he's had this season that he's had, where he had a lot of success at the American Hockey League level? He had another opportunity at the National Hockey League level, and he would have had more, and everybody, including him, knows it, if it had not been for his high ankle sprain early in the season and his injury in the middle of the season. He would have had more opportunities. How does he handle that with the fact that they're going to push young guys and he could be the first name on the list going into camp? That's going to be something that, if he handles well, you could see Sam Poulin, as you mentioned, being the guy right out of camp and being a solid contributor out of camp as well. And that's everything the Penguins would want, especially if they can get him as a third line center. That would be to push down Eller and to move over Achari, or maybe move on from one of those 2 guys in their salary cap hit to open up space for other young guys. That would be the best case scenario for the Pittsburgh Penguins. So obviously these are all discussions that we can have again, as we still have multiple months until anything happens. July 1st is going to be a date that we have circled and we are ready for, because that's when a lot of this movement is going to happen. That's when the picture becomes a little bit more clear as to what the Penguins will look like in 2024-25. But as of right now, those names are all names that are going to get an opportunity at training camp, which means training camp is going to be a heck of a lot of fun this fall. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Inside the Penguins or anywhere you get your podcasts from.